Thanks so much, Melanie and Michaela. That was a really great presentation. It's hit on some alarming points, especially around Parliament's reluctance to develop a less anthropocentric approach to animals and animal welfare, and certainly given us a lot to think about alternate methods for achieving the same ends, especially in the cosmetic industry. I would now like to hand over to Professor David Bilchitz, who is a professor in the Department of Public Law at the University of Johannesburg, and is the director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional, Public, Human Rights and International Law. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, and greetings, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, okay, brilliant. So firstly, congratulations to the organizers on this excellent conference, and also delighted to have this panel, and thank you to Melanie for the invitation. And also, I think it's really wonderful to have, actually for a long time, often animals are not placed on environmental law and considered so much within the environmental frame. So I think this is refreshing and exciting. So I'm going to talk to you today about this case that I've just been involved with. Sadly, the news is not good from it. But in 2019, I learned that the Kuwait Livestock Transport and Trading Company had reached an agreement with the South African government to begin live export of sheep to the Persian Gulf. They set up a subsidiary in South Africa called Al Mawashi, which was created for the purpose, and they justify the reasons for this export as being that people in the Gulf desire fresh meat, so it's freshly slaughtered, because it doesn't make so much sense why you can't slaughter the animals in South Africa rather than sending them on a long journey, and also worries about religious slaughter, though that is also not very convincing because South Africa has its own halal framework of slaughter. Now, around 70,000 animals are transported on these ships, and in one go, that's in one shipment, right? It's not in total. And there are very serious welfare concerns, from the loading of the animals, which the SPCA has looked on and seen awful things happening, to the actual voyage itself. I mean, these are firstly land animals who shipped for 21 days on sea, for example. I mean, they just imagine a sheep going to sea. That really, it's not, I mean, we don't do so well on sea, many of us, right? Secondly, they have a new diet, and that often leads many animals not to eat properly, and they can starve because they don't properly eat. They also, some of them can't access the food because they cram together. I'll just show you the kind of conditions. One of the major worries with the Gulf is heat stress. The temperatures at the moment in Kuwait are around 44 degrees. Now imagine having a woolen coat around you, right? And going into that and being crammed amongst lots of other creatures, okay? And so a number of animals actually die from heat stress. There's a buildup, of course, of ammonia on the decks. What happens to all the waste? The waste contaminates the feed, so many of these animals get sick. Many of the weaker animals are not able to feed, so they themselves, again, starve. And these are just a few of the welfare concerns relating to the actual time on board, and what happens to the sick animals, for example, that are not well. And then, of course, there is a concern when they arrive on the slaughter and the standards that are applied. Now, apart from these welfare concerns, which, as Melanie has in fact just been argued, okay, and Michaela have just argued about this important integration of welfare concerns. There are also general environmental concerns that are often linked, right? I was looking up a bit and discovered that actually I didn't know this, but sheep are in fact the largest producer of greenhouse gases. I thought it was cows. I gave you some of the various statistics over there in terms of kilograms of CO2. They have a 3-week unnecessary voyage, of course, which is increasing methane emissions. There are hundreds of tons of sewage that are pumped into the ocean, right? So again, pollution of the ocean itself. And then there are also the human costs. The condition of the seafarers who are on these boats, Apparently, those who have gone on it have seen that they're not treated very well either. The ammonia conditions harm these humans as well, given the high buildup. And of course, then we've just heard a little bit about zoonotic disease and the potential by putting animals all together for the increase in the risks of disease, not only in the eventual meat, which often is increased by contamination of the animals themselves, but also in the risk of them being together and new bacteria, new viruses being developed in these pack conditions. So since its inception of this trade in South Africa, this has happened elsewhere before, particularly in New Zealand and Australia, where it's been very controversial. But it just recently started in South Africa, and there have been attempts by the NSPCA to stop the trade. They launched an action in court in relation to the ship that was recently docked in East London to try and stop it from taking the animals. And there was an urgent interdict and a final interdict. The final case has not been heard. Initially, they were successful in terms of getting an urgent interdict to stop the ship leaving. And the case was made out in terms of the Animal Protection Act and the potential violations that would take place. Unfortunately, about a week ago, 10 days ago, we learned that the judge had ordered that the ship could go ahead, but subject to welfare standards being met. That was important because it was recognized that welfare does matter. And actually, as I understand it, the government had to certify in an affidavit that these had been met. I have deep suspicions that this was treated as a tick box exercise, because it's very hard to see how these rather stringent standards could have been met in good faith in the short amount of time between the elapsing of the order and the ship being loaded. They started loading the ship a few days, as I understand it, about 5 days after the order. And sadly, I learned yesterday that the ship has in fact departed. So this ship has gone, but of course there is a lot of question marks that come up also around, by the way, the administrative justice, administrative law dimensions of how the government is exercising its functions and rule of law dimensions of compliance with court orders. Now, here I wanted to suggest that the Animal Protection Act is not all that's at issue in terms of this trade, although that's very important. But the key issue really relates to the place of animals in our constitutional order, which the last presentation did also seek to address. And I'm going to just address it from a bit of a different angle. Melanie mentioned I have made an argument for animal rights, or being able, actually the Bill of Rights being protective of animals in their own right, and various rights being able to be read into the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to make that argument today. I'm going to focus on animals and their space within the environmental right. And I'm going to take an approach that I previously argued for, which I call the integrative approach. And I'm going to try and move it beyond the focus which I've done before in relation to wild animals, and consider how it applies in the context of a trade such as live export and domestic animals. And I suppose wanting to make some wider points about the integration of concerns relating to humans, animals, and the environment more generally. So all those concerns relating together in an approach to the environmental right itself. So hopefully fitting into this conference and also linking in with other concerns that people have. So where are animals in the environmental right? Not clearly there in terms of in terms of obvious mention, okay, but there are ways in which one can find space in which one can find animals in the right, okay. I've just put in bold some of those, but we'll go on to looking at them. Clearly, the environment itself as a notion seems to include all those who live in the environment around us, and not just humans. And that is made clear in NEMA as well, that animals fall within the environment more generally. So one should not, of course, use legislation to interpret the Constitution, but nevertheless, it is a reasonable interpretation, and as we've heard, has been found in the case law, that animals form part of the environment, and so they form part of this right. Now, one of the obvious areas in relation to which animals form part of the environmental right would be conservation, because that's often a notion related to animals. Okay, and in the past, I've distinguished two approaches to interpreting the notion of conservation. the aggregative approach sees the focus of conservation as being on the species as a whole and allows for the sacrifice of individuals for the goal of protecting the species, for instance. It is also an anthropocentric view often, because it focuses on conservation as it is understood from our point of view, from achieving overall happiness for humans, okay? And it essentially generally asserts human priority of our interests over the interests of any other creatures or other facets of the environment, right? So the aggregative approach generally treats the environment as an aggregate. We're kind of individuals, and as individuals, we take precedence over the rest of the mass of the environment as a whole. The integrative approach focuses both on the survival of individuals and species. It integrates a relationship of respect for individuals, and it argues that without respect for individuals, it will be difficult to actually ensure the survival of species. It is importantly non-anthropocentric. It seeks to integrate concerns for humans, animals, and the wider environment. Okay? And when there's a conflict, how does that conflict get resolved? Well, it's not by an established priority of human over non-human. Rather, it's about balancing of interests that needs to take place. Okay? Now, the illustration, a good illustration of this, it sounds very theoretical, is trophy hunting, right? Those who advocate for an aggregative approach basically argue that trophy hunting is a good thing, right? You have a conservation organization. Great, 10 minutes, thank you. Saying that it is for the benefit of the species as a whole. We can have some animals shot in order to bring in money for the country. And that will give people an incentive to protect the species, because they see that species is making, protection of animals is making them money, okay? And so ultimately the goal is the protection of A, giving benefits to us through money, right? And B, as well, the wider system, right? We want to protect lions, but not every individual lion, right? And so we can kill individuals for the advancement of the wider group of lions, so to speak. An integrative approach would reject the idea that the sacrifice of a range of individuals can advance the goal of species conservation. It would argue that respect for individuals is essential to preserving the species as a whole. It is also more holistic. It considers the effect of such a policy on humans, the individual animals, and the environment as a whole. Now, I've also sought to apply this interpretation to the notion in 24 as well of sustainable use of natural resources, which is used strongly by our government a lot to justify the exploitative practices it allows. And I've tried to show why we should reject this notion, that the sustainable use notion, as it's interpreted by our government, sees animals fundamentally as instruments simply for our ends. And that notion, integrating that notion into our consciousness, is a very concerning notion and will ultimately lead to the destruction of animals, okay? They are subordinate to the economic benefits that we may obtain from their existence, okay? I argue that a better notion of sustainability itself, the notion of sustainability, is to approach it from an integrative perspective, okay? It is only where individual animals are respected and afforded protection for their interests that any use of an animal can be called sustainable. Sustainable use on this view enshrines a conception whereby any use is legitimate only if it is done in a manner compatible with respect for the animal or other entity. It would thus reject the killing of lions for mere pleasure or entertainment in trophy hunting as a form of sustainable use, even if overall lions are not threatened, because they would come to be threatened. Now, which approach should one adopt? Okay, well, in the South African Law Journal article where I elaborate on this, and also a book by Werner Schultz on international environmental law and animal welfare, I attempt to provide arguments why the integrative approach is preferable. In very brief summary, I argue that only the integrative approach can address our ethical obligations to treat animals with respect for their intrinsic value. Okay. I also argue more ambitiously, well, not more ambitiously, but let's say as a different tack, I argue that only the integrative approach can actually succeed in achieving the very goals of the aggregative approach. That is the long-term survival of the species, because the instrumentalization of animals is a recipe for leading to threats to their long-term survival. And only the integrative approach can integrate our understanding of the relationship between individuals and the species. Now, in our courts, I would suggest to you we've had support for the integrative approach. The SCA in Lem Tong Tai says constitutional values dictate a more caring attitude towards fellow humans, animals, and the environment more generally. And in the last presentation, you heard about the NSPCA case. I won't go into it in more detail, but the case expressly references the integrative approach, saying it correctly links suffering of individual animals to conservation. Okay? So it seems like this is something that's being thought about and adopted in our courts. So can we extend the approach more generally? Okay? I would argue that those dicta that we have from the courts suggest a way of approaching the environmental right which goes beyond its usage in the context of conservation and sustainable use. It actually is an injunction, that caring attitude in Lem Tong Tai, to actually think about the whole environmental right in those terms. So 24A, that we must live in an environment not harmful to our health and well-being, should be interpreted in an integrative way, to recognize that there's a symbiotic relationship between humans, animals, and the environment, and our well-being is harmed by cruel treatment and vice versa, okay? And this is borne out. People don't draw the links. They say, oh, there was this big outbreak in meat factories of COVID-19. But why was there such a big outbreak, right, in meat factories? And why in the beginning was COVID-19 coming, as we heard, through animal vectors, okay? They linked. Our well-being is linked to those of others. And if we haven't seen that now, then I don't know when we're going to see that, okay? Pollution and ecological degradation. This requires interlinking of our lives, other fauna, flora, and environmental dimensions, okay? So it's not just about, our effects, it's about the interrelationship between us. And similarly, the last segment of the right, justifiable economic and social development, must have reference to interrelationship between human, animal, and the environment, and give respect to each component, okay? And so how would this apply? Sorry, I think I missed out a slide there. Yes, no, sorry, let me go up. Yes, okay, there we go. So how would this apply to live export of animals? Okay, well, as I've said, it's interesting to move beyond wild animals to start thinking about how practices around factory farming and our treatment in general of animals are related to the environmental right. This isn't work that's been done much at the moment, but we need to rethink this if we're going to address both our treatment of animals and be able to live in an environment which is not going to be destroyed through climate change. So I would argue in 24A that our well-being is connected with the well-being of other creatures. Cruel treatment of them harms us. So I already talked to you about the harm to seafarers. By reducing our interest in animals, there's an interrelationship between animals and humans. We know that actually people who, that there is a clear, for example, abattoir workers, in studies done of abattoir workers, that there's a clear harm to those workers through their treatment of animals. And we've learned that also that abuse of animals in private often leads to abuse in, okay, I see the timing, abuse in domestic abuse of women and children, that these are very much linked. Okay, so there's a link here, and part of our exploitative view of certain people like seafarers is connected here as well with actually instrumentalization, creatures who shouldn't be instrumentalized. CO2 emissions are often linked, not thought about. Zoonotic disease I've mentioned, okay? Pollution and degradation. What about the sewerage? That's not thought about. That's going into the ocean. Large amounts of sewerage. How is it affecting our oceans? How is it affecting, all the creatures in the oceans and the water, for example, that may come to that when the ships go past and the water comes up and people bathe in it and get ill, okay? Again, CO2 emissions. And lastly, the justifiable economic development and sustainable development. Well, the main argument for this practice from our government is, well, it's about the creation of jobs. We want to create jobs, and no matter which industry it will create jobs, we will go with it. Well, firstly, that is profoundly immoral, right? And we know this has come up as well around coal, okay, and coal production, etc., and the use of coal. But we ultimately, this is not a way of thinking that is promoted by our environmental right. Our environmental right requires us to create jobs. We must develop. Of course, no one's standing against development. And we want all our people to have jobs in South Africa, but not at the expense of other humans, other animals, or the environment. We have to see them as interconnected. And in that, there's a test as well of balancing, ultimately. And I would argue, even if, now I'm opposed to meat eating generally, right? And I would argue that it's unsustainable on environmental terms. But even if you accept that meat eating is acceptable under certain conditions, the voyage is wasteful and causes unnecessary harm. So the animals, if you accept they were going to be slaughtered, they could be slaughtered in South Africa. Don't subject them to this, and don't accept an industry that allows for such unsustainable practices. Okay? So in conclusion, I've tried to suggest to you this approach of the environmental right, extending this integrative approach to the domestic sphere of animals that are used and are abused in our food, in related to food. That I've suggested that we need to change our approach to one that recognizes a deep interconnection between ourselves and other features of the world. Melanie and Michaela took the words out of my mouth. I was actually going to end with African environmentalism and Ubuntu, okay? And actually the philosopher Mogobe Ramose, who writes, the principle of wholeness applies to the relation between human beings and physical or objective nature. To care for one another, therefore, implies caring for physical nature as well. Without such care, interdependence between human beings and physical nature would be undermined. I would argue an integrative approach represents the outcome of Ubuntu, of these relational values, and building an interpretation of Section 24 that reflects this ethos and integrates an attitude of respect. Practices such as live export are inconsistent with this approach. The government should desist from doing this, and if it doesn't, it should be struck down as unconstitutional. And ultimately, part of the goal of the environmental right should be to develop in us a deep respect for animal life, as well as all features of the rich tapestry of the environment in which we live. Thank you very much.